morning. You already know what time it is. Some of you love it, some of you hate it, some of you, it's your first time here and you're about to make up your mind if you love it or you hate it. On a Sunday morning at Eastwind, we have a few questions for you to turn to maybe someone that you came with or make a new friend in the seats next to you, and just talk about these concepts that we bring up on a Sunday morning. What do you think about it? What would you do with that? So we have a few questions. If you're new and you're joining us for the first time, and you absolutely hate that I'm doing this to you right off the bat, you have my full permission to just give me a really dirty look for the next 60 seconds while everyone else chats, okay? But I would love to have us start just with a really simple question, maybe get to know you for someone new near you. What is a memorable movie ending? We're gonna talk a little bit about endings this morning, and endings are so important, especially in art. In the first service, like half the room said Sixth Sense, okay? So I'm so sorry if I just stole your thunder on that one. Half the room was like, Sixth Sense, I've never seen it. I'm sorry to disappoint you right off the bat. It is what it is, okay? Go ahead and turn to a couple folks next to you. What's a memorable or a favorite movie ending? And then we'll come back this morning. Take just a minute, wrap up your comments. Here's the thing. This morning we're going to chat a little bit about endings. We're going to chat a little bit about finishing. If we hadn't had the opportunity to meet, my name is Katie. I'm the junior high pastor here, and we're wrapping up. You're joining us as we're wrapping up this series about pre-deciding, okay? We're in this kind of six, 7-part series that we're talking about what it means to live a life of intention. So let me just recap and get us all on the same page real quick. We're looking at what it means to decide ahead of time what we're going to do in different settings or in different circumstances, different situations. So we've kind of used this as the baseline, right? When faced with blank, fill in that blank, whatever it is, I have pre-decided to blank. And Carlos pointed out early on in this series the uncomfortably true concepts that many of us don't just wake up one day and go, how did I get here? My life is so solid. My marriage is on track. My career is on track. My finances are in a good spot. My friendships are incredible. How did this even happen? I have no idea. I just fell into a really healthy life. That's not how it works. We don't wake up one day and go, how did I accidentally get incredibly fit and healthy? I have no clue how that happened. That's not really how things work. It's usually the exact opposite, that we wake up one day and go, how did my relationships get this messy? How did I get to the level of unhealth that I'm in? How did I get out of habits that were really good for me? How did I fall into some poor habits financially? How did I get here? Usually when we wake up and we accidentally find ourselves somewhere, it's a place that we don't want to be. And so the idea of this series that we've been doing in this new year is when we're faced with different situations in which we need to make a choice, we already know what that choice is. We've already decided who we are and what we stand for. We've thought ahead of time about what we want to do. And the premise is really simple. It's that quality decisions lead to a quality life. Decisions of a poor quality will lead to a life of a poor quality. But decisions of a high quality will lead to a life of a high quality. And maybe you're in here this morning and you would say, I'm a follower of Jesus, I'm a Christian, every part of my life is here for that. This is true for that. And maybe you're in here this morning and you go, I don't know about the whole faith and spirituality thing. I'm asking some questions, I'm exploring some things. This is still true for that. The decisions that we make directly affect the outcome of our lives. And so week after week, we've been looking at different aspects of what it means to make quality decisions. Each week has been a different kind of decision, a different kind of characteristic that we want to carry with us in the day-to-day. So you can say, I'm ready, I am consistent, I am devoted, I am generous, and I am faithful. And last week we talked about that, the idea of obedience, even that we were singing about a little bit this morning, the idea of being faithful in every part of what we do. All 5 of these affect the way that we live our day-to-day lives. And this morning we wrap this series up with one more. I'm ready, consistent, devoted, generous, faithful. And this morning we look at I am a finisher. I am a finisher. And there's a big difference sometimes between endings and finishing things. Endings just happen to us, and we're going to talk about that this morning. Endings can happen left and right, like it or not. But finishing something is an accomplishment. Finishing something is absolutely crucial. And incredible endings, like some of the movies that you just discussed, can stick with us for forever. Incredible finishes in sports can stick with us for forever. It is too soon for me to mention the rare overtime that we saw last week at the Super Bowl. It's too soon for me to mention that to the Niners fans in here, so I'm not going to mention it. But finishes make or break so many different moments in our lives. The way that things finish is the most important part of it. If you watched the game, you heard the ref say as they entered overtime, this is a new game now. And that's how it is so often for so many of us with finishes, is when we get towards that finish line, it turns into a brand new game. The way we finish is so crucial. But because finishing and ending is so complicated, it can be very bittersweet. It can be incredibly hard. It can be confusing. It can be surprising. Endings can be unexpected. We never see them coming. Endings can be tragic in many, many ways. And so because it's this kind of touchy and complicated subject, that's why Carlos asked me to talk about it today. Because it's kind of this touchy and complicated subject, we don't necessarily sit down many times in our life and reflect and say, how do I be a great finisher? Endings happen to us left and right in our lives, but we rarely sit back. And I've rarely had people come to me or I to them and say, do you know what I want to do? I want to be an incredible finisher. How do I finish things in my life really well? Because that's such a bittersweet space to be in. But we know intuitively the power of things ending. It can make or break entire situations. We know that how something ends can affect the way that we see that thing permanently. A lot of research has started to show that however something ends is how we forever remember that thing. You can think about this and know it's generally true. If you're in a relationship, maybe a romantic relationship or a close friend, if that relationship has a messy ending, that's forever the first thing that you think of when you think of that person. If you're in a job or a career that's just absolutely fantastic, and then one day it comes to an unfair or an unexpected end, we tend to say things like, well, the company was trash all along. It could have been many years that were great with it, but that ending sets the tone for how we think about it moving forward. When I was in high school, we coined a term for how checked out we could get as high school seniors. When I was in high school, they started being called victims of senioritis, because you just checked out your senior year. And you would hear seniors who maybe loved high school in freshman and sophomore year say things like, high school's the worst. I can't wait to get out of here, right? How we finish affects how we view the whole entity, but it's not something that we reflect on. It's something that we often just let the endings happen to us in some way or another. As per usual, a video on the internet illustrates this far better than I probably ever could, and so I want to turn this over to a little girl who is grappling with what it means for things to end. This is a brief video, an interaction with her and her mom, and she's having a hard time either accepting or allowing something to end. And I think it is so many of us when faced with various scenarios of what it means to actually see something end and handle it in a reasonable way. Turn your attention to the screen here.
What do you have? Do not put that on your face.
A mouse.
Where did you find that?
It was in the backyard.
Okay, I need you to throw it in the trash can, okay?
No, it's our pet.
It's dead, and mice carry diseases.
I want to keep a rat. It's a mouse, remember? I want to keep a mouse.
Ella, it's dead.
It was alive.
When? Did you kill it? Ella.
We didn't kill it. We kept it, and it was very good. And then, for some reason, it just weirdly died.
Yeah, okay. Well, you're going to throw it away, and then we're going to wash those gloves. I don't want you to get sick.
So many of us in different endings and scenarios in life are Ella, where something ends, it was very good, and then it weirdly died, right? Sometimes we're very responsible for that weirdly death. And something ends, and we don't really want to accept that. And then there's just this dead mouse flopping around in the video, and you go, Ella, honey, it's done. Like, you got to let this thing go. But so many of us don't know how to handle endings well. As children and as adults, endings are this confusing, complicated, emotional process that when we see new pages turn or we see doors close, handling those endings is so difficult. It could be summed up like this: endings are an unavoidable part of life, but finishing is intentional. Endings are going to happen whether we invite them or not. But finishing is an intentional way of life. It's a completely different thing than just letting things end. Ending can be so complicated and messy and something that we maybe need to spend more time considering how to do well. But finishing, we know when something has been finished well. And we know so much, in fact, that I'm actually going to invite you to turn to one another again and just share what is something that had a good ending in your own life. You get to choose how deep of a story you share with this. You get to choose if you want it to be something very important to you or something that's a little more surface level. But I think many of us know when something has a good ending, even if it's bittersweet, even if it was a sad ending, we know the difference between a good ending and a bad one, a good finish and a bad finish. And so take just a moment and turn to a couple folks around you. What's something that had a good ending in your own life? And then I'll bring us back in just a minute. Take just a second. We could tell so many stories in this room, regardless of where you are in terms of spirituality or belief in God. We could tell story after story after story about good and bad endings in our life, the impact that they have had on us, the impacts that we have had on others. Good and bad endings in our lives have these ripple effects that we know of deeply. We know this intuitively, many of us, that this is something that impacts our day-to-day life. Something you'll hear said around Eastwind a lot is we believe that Jesus makes your life better and makes you better at life. And it's kind of this simple sentence that just talks about how we believe a life in a relationship with Jesus is going to impact not only you individually, but all those in your circles as well. We believe that if you follow Jesus, your life will become better. It will be a more human life. And Jesus will make you better at living a human life. And that impact is going to ripple to those around you. And this includes even something like finishing well. This is kind of the framework that we use to look at the life of Jesus and go, how does he set the standard for what it means to live a life of faith? And so we look at Jesus' life. You can read in the Bible, it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the biographies of Jesus' days on earth. And he was alive on earth for 33 years before his life was abruptly ended. He was arrested on false charges and executed by the state unfairly and eventually resurrected from the dead. And that's the crux of the whole belief system of Christianity. But before we get to that, we sometimes skip over the fact that when we look at this man who lived 2,000 years ago and he lived for just 33 years, his life was cut short. If we knew somebody who died at 33 years old, we would say, it was too soon. That was before their time. Their life was cut short. There's so much that they left unfinished. There's so much that should have been there for them. And yet we look at Jesus' life, and the week before he goes to his death, we have this recorded prayer where he speaks to God, and he's kind of saying, he knows he's going to die in the next week. He knows that this is going to happen, and he's kind of praying his way through his life on earth. And he actually says these words. He says, Father, I have brought you glory on earth by finishing the work that you gave me to do. This is repeated in several other places in Scripture. He had an unfairly short life. It was cut off with violence. And yet he still gets to the end of his life and says, I finished it, everything. I did everything I was supposed to do. And that doesn't mean he did everything. He had the ability to say yes to some things and no to others because he had a clear sense of what he was about. But everything that he said he was going to do, he did. This is absolutely astonishing because I don't know of any other field in which you can even get close to a 100% completion rate. Sales, marketing, sports, putting a meal on the table for dinner time. I don't know of anything in which we get even close to aspiring for a 100% completion rate, and yet Jesus did that. Every single thing that he said he was going to do, he finished. And he got to the end of his seemingly too short life and said, I did everything. I finished well. And he entered a position that would make many of us full of angst and anxiety, and he had peace and confidence because he had done what he set out to do. This is repeated in Scripture multiple times. He is a finisher. We see it extend not only to his life on earth, but also to the way that Jesus interacts with us. When you start a relationship with Jesus, when you say, I want to know what it means to obey Jesus and follow him, I want a better life and I want to be better at life, we see that Jesus offers help. And it's not on us to do all of the work because the heavy lifting is too heavy for us. We see in some of the letters to the early churches this being said, being confident of this, that Jesus, who began a good work in you, will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. The same Jesus that has a 100% completion rate during his time on earth. Everything he says he's going to do, he does. There are no exceptions. He then turns to each of us and says, everything I've started in you, I will also finish. Everything that looks like a mess right now, it's okay. I will bring it to completion. I will finish it. I'm a finisher. I don't start things and leave them half done. I finish everything. And so then we are invited, right? We are invited to reflect on this life of Jesus and go, what would it be like for that to be true of us? What would it be like for people to look at us and say, they're a finisher? Whatever they say, they do. Everything they start, they complete. They carry things all the way through. And the invitation is this, that we can be finishers because Jesus was a finisher. The invitation of the Christian life is that whatever Jesus does, you are invited to do as well. And so when we look at his life and see him be good to his word in everything, we then look at our lives and go, how do we be good to our word in everything? How do we finish even the messy stuff? How do we finish even the complicated things? How do we finish the circumstances and scenarios where I can't make heads or tails of things anymore? I might need some real help to figure out how to finish well, how to end well. But Jesus was a finisher. So how can I be too? How can I end things well when I need to end things well? How can I persevere when I'm bored or just over something? How can I carry through in the ways I need to carry through in finishing things well? This sentiment is echoed over and over again in the scriptures, many times in letters to the early churches that were sent to remind them how to live a life of following Jesus. It's just said explicitly. The Apostle Paul, who was an early church planter and leader, said it very directly in the letter to the Corinthians. He says this, here is my advice. I love this man because nobody asked for his advice, okay? But he says, I have something important to say and you all are going to listen, okay? Here is my advice. It would be good for you to finish what you started a year ago. This is a church that got very excited. They saw a need in a nearby, another local church that was poor and needed some help, and they saw some need, and they said, let's take up a big collection to help them cover some basic essentials. And this church got very excited about it. The Corinthians said, yeah, we would love to be a part of this. And then, as many good aspirations do, the wheels fell off shortly, and all the excitement died off, and they had started this big fundraising project to take care of some of their poor neighbors, and they quit halfway through, essentially. They forgot why it mattered, and they let the thing kind of fall by the wayside. And Paul says, don't be that kind of person. Don't be that kind of community. Don't get excited about a cause and rally behind it and then forget it ever existed and move on with your life. He says, it will be good for you to finish what you started a year ago. Last year, you were the first who wanted to give, and you were the first to begin doing it. Now you should finish what you started. Paul isn't just saying this to them because he needs to take up some money. He's saying this to them because he knows it's a matter of character. When we come to a place where something is hard to carry forward, it's when our character is most tried and tested. It's when our true colors sometimes come out the easiest. And whether that's trying to work through something and see a new beginning for something that was difficult and hard, whether it's actually having to close some doors and end some relationships, whatever it is, there is a way to do it well and to complete the things that we start in a meaningful fashion, to finish well and to finish honorably. And Paul says, that's what I want for you. I want you to be finishers. I don't want you to go through life and have all of these half-started things and have the anxiety of being someone that can never finish what you start. I want you to be finishers. I want you to be able to buckle down and finish what you started. Now, the difficulty in this is, I don't need to prove to us that humans are incredibly bad at finishing things. I'm not going to ask for like a raise of hands, but if I ask you how many of you haven't switched your laundry over from the washer to the dryer yet this weekend, or I ask you how many of you have dishes in the sink at home, or unfinished projects on your platforms at work, or 6 books by the side of your bed that you started every single one of them and you haven't finished any of them, we're bad finishers. It doesn't come supernaturally to us. And one of the reasons why we're bad finishers is our brain actually works against us on this one. I'm fascinated by the field of neuroscience. I'm not nearly smart enough to be dabbling in it, but I do all the same. And I'm so interested in the ways in which our brains work for or against us. And here's the thing, in the matters of finishing, our brain is not super helpful. Here's why. One of the things I've learned is that our brains have a pretty tough time discerning between imagination and reality. If we had a little more time, I would take us through this little exercise. You take 4 or 5 minutes, and I describe an orange. Verbally, just describe an orange and the rind and the smell of it and how it tastes and what you would experience if you open it. Just verbally describe opening and eating an orange. And the thing is, this study has been done time and time again. Most people their mouths start to water. There's no orange. There's no real orange in the picture here. But just the description of an orange can make your mouth start to water. Your brain can't understand. There's no real orange here that we're going to eat. But your body, your physiological self starts to respond and your mouth starts to water and says, ooh, tangy citrus, I'm ready. I'm ready to eat an orange now. Our brains do this with everything. Our brains can trick us into thinking that we've done something that was just something that we imagined. This comes up a lot in productivity learning. So for example, if you say, I'm going to get really fit, I'm going to get really healthy, I'm going to get a brand new gym membership, I'm going to go to the gym every day. You go to the gym and you buy the membership. What's the first thing you do? You text a whole bunch of friends. Guess who got their gym membership today, right? And what that actually does, just talking about it, you haven't worked out once, but just talking about it, the reward center of your brain starts to release dopamine, which is like the reward chemical. It makes you feel, yes, I've accomplished something. It starts to release dopamine because your brain is saying, I'm imagining myself working out. And it has some of the same releases chemically in your brain as the reality of working out does. And so your brain says, good job, go us. That's so awesome, right? We see this in everyday life. If you have kids and you say, hey, can you do the dishes? And they say, yeah, I'll do the dishes, no problem, right? And then they're like, well, I really thought I did them. It felt like I did them. I said I was going to do them. I had every intention of doing them. And the dishes are still sitting there unwashed. Our brain does this to us time and time and time again, of tricking us into thinking that we've accomplished more than we actually have. So when it comes to finishing, we can very easily fool ourselves, and we can sit back and go, do you know what I want to do is this relationship has to end. It's really complicated. I want to finish it well. I'm going to do my best. And then maybe we don't actually do it, but our brain will give us the benefit of the doubt because we go, well, I had every intention. Or you have to finish a huge project for work or school, and you'll go, you know what, I'm gonna absolutely crush this. And then you find yourself cramming the night before, and you go, I was so sure. How did I get here? I was so sure that I was gonna do it correctly. And I could go on and on. We could see this in our everyday life all over the place, that we imagine ourselves to be much better at things than we actually are because our brains are tricking us into thinking we're much better at things than we actually are. And so we're left with this reality in which we don't often finish things. We don't often follow through on our best intentions. And it can be a discouraging reality to sit in. It can be a discouraging reality to say, I know, Katie, I've actually lived so much life and I've had so many good intentions and I've dropped the ball so many times. And it would be easy for us to sit in that anxiety for ourselves of saying, I have some chapters I wish I could rewrite. I have some endings I wish I could do differently. I have some things that I wish I could have made better decisions in this kind of way. I didn't pre-decide, and it caught up to me. It got the best of me. And it would be easy for us to sit in the bad feelings or the shame of that. But that's not what this space is for this morning. This space is for saying, what can we do to live a life that still finishes well? What can we do to hold some tension with some messes that we've made and still move forward and be a better finisher going forward? What can we do to live in the reality of believing that Jesus will actually finish what he started in our lives, and it's not up to us to carry the full weight of these things? Some of you who maybe just need encouragement today for some things that you're trying to finish well, or for some things that you're processing that didn't finish well, some of you might just need to memorize this verse. So put it on your lock screen or write it on a card and tape it somewhere that you'll see it. Let these words go with you this week to know that Jesus is not going to leave you alone in the things that you're trying or not trying to finish, and the things that you did or didn't finish well in the past. That Jesus is actually the one who has the strength to have that 100% completion rate. We know we don't have that in us. But Jesus invites us to a space of doing it better and improving and growing and developing. And then out of that, to be able to get to the end of our lives and say, I get to finish this life well. I had some ups and downs. I had some highs and lows. I had some bumps in the road. I had some things that I didn't finish the way that I should have. But this whole life, this whole story that Jesus is telling can still end well. There's a lot of ways we could illustrate this or talk about this, but I want to kind of, if you will, come with me on a case study. I want to look at a player in the Old Testament, a man who takes up an incredible amount of ink, 25 chapters. That's really unprecedented for most people whose stories are told in the Bible. But this man's story is told over the scope of 25 chapters in the book of Genesis. His name is Jacob, and he's a very messy character. So before we kind of case study how he handled endings in his life, here's the filter I want us to put on. Oftentimes, when we read the Bible, it can be tempting to treat it like an Aesop's Fables type of book, where we read it and go, okay, what's the life lesson? What's the leadership lesson? What's the parenting lesson? What can I learn from this person's life? And then we try to draw maybe a moral lesson from that story, right? And we say, okay, well, this worked for them, and so I'm gonna be just like David. I'm gonna be just like Ruth. I'm gonna be just like Solomon, whatever it is, right? But that's a dangerous way to read the scriptures, because every single person in the Bible, with the exception being Jesus, every single person is deeply broken and does some incredibly questionable things. And if we read the stories saying, I want to be like this person, we'll eventually hit a wall where we have to go, well, what about the liars and the cheats and the, dirty scoundreling that they did? What about the killing of other people that they did? What about the very questionable behavior in a variety of circumstances? And so we can't approach and say, I just need to take a moral lesson from this person's life, and whatever they did, I'll do too. Instead, I want to invite us this morning to look at Jacob's life with a slightly different perspective. To look instead and say, what in Jacob's life reminds me of me? What in the good and the bad that he did reminds me of me? And I go, he was a little bit of a cheater. I did that at work a couple years ago too. I relate to this guy. And we're not judging it. We're not saying it's good or bad. We're just saying, I see myself in this story. And then you follow up and you say, and what does this story tell me about God? What does this story tell me about a God that meets very messy people right where they're at and says, I think I have a better way for you to live life. Come with me on this. try doing it a little bit differently. I have a better way to live. So here's my invitation. If you have your notes with you or if you have a note app on your phone, I'm going to just give us a 30,000-foot view of a few highlights from Jacob's story. It's 25 chapters. We're not going to cover near close to everything, but I want to hit just a few chapter headings, if you will, of things that happened in his life. And as I mention them, I would invite you to just write down any that stick out to you, any that you go, oh, that's, whether you go, oh, that's kind of relatable, I've had a similar experience in life, or you go, that's just confusing or odd, or you go, that's really encouraging, I appreciate hearing that. Whatever it is, just take note of those things. And as you're listening, ask yourself, what is God doing with this thing? What is God doing with this scenario? What is God doing with this situation? So Jacob's story starts in Genesis 25. So 25 chapters in, his story starts, and he's a bit of a messy start. He's a twin, so you already know there's just going to be an incredible amount of drama, right? He's a twin, and while his mom is still pregnant with him and his brother, Esau, while his mom is still pregnant with them, it's a very tough pregnancy, and the story goes that they were fighting in her womb a lot, to the point that she finally was like, I need some answers. And she went to a spiritual person and said, can you give me a prophecy or an explanation or something? What's happening with these babies fighting in my womb? And they said what any expectant mother would want to hear, these two are going to hate each other. They're going to be divided. They're going to fight all the time. They're going to hate each other. They're going to argue over everything. They're going to actually try to conquer each other. And it's this terrible prophecy. No mother wants to hear this about their expectant children. But the prophecy turns out to be true. They're born, and Esau is born just before Jacob. And in this society and culture, the firstborn gets everything. The firstborn son gets everything. They inherit everything from their father, and the rest of the kids just kind of have to deal with it. So imagine spending your entire life knowing that your older brother beat you out by like 2 minutes, okay? They're 2 minutes older, but because of that, they get everything. As you can imagine, tensions were high, and Jacob, as an adult, he says, actually, I don't like this ending. I don't like the ending where I don't get anything. I'm going to try and change some of this ending. And he decides to trick Esau out of his birthright. The birthright would be handed. The father would bless the oldest son with the words. And once the words were said, it was locked in. And now that belongs to the son. Okay, this is just the way this culture worked. And so Jacob, with the questionable blessing of his mother, tricks both Esau, his older brother, and his father into getting the blessing that Esau actually was supposed to have. As you can imagine, Esau was not a fan. He was very upset about this and said, as soon as the time has come for me to grieve that my father has died and given the blessing to the wrong person, as soon as that time is up, I'm going to kill Jacob. And he promised. He said, I'll kill him on sight. Like as soon as this time is up, I'm going to kill that man on sight. It's the only way I can get my birthright back. So now Jacob's in this weird ending position where he has the birthright, but he really can't do anything with it because his life's at risk. And so he flees. His mom says, well, that kind of backfired. Let's send you to live with your uncle Laban. He goes to live with his uncle Laban. That is a whole mess in and of itself. He marries a couple of his cousins. It's like a whole situation, okay? He lives with his uncle Laban for 20 years, and he works for 20 years for his uncle, and the business prospers. He's actually a very successful businessman, and he's raising these goats and sheep, and he brings a ton of wealth to his uncle's empire. And as success does, at some point he sits back and he goes, I actually should have a way bigger cut of this than I do. Why don't I have, and bottom line, he and his uncle get into a knockdown, drag-out fight, and they end up splitting. They draw, like the back seat of a car when you have little kids that are like, don't cross the line, stop touching me, right? They basically do that as grown men. They say, here's a line in our territory. You stay on your side, Laban. You stay on your side, Jacob. Let's just split all our resources in half and do it. And his successful businessman era kind of comes to this abrupt and awkward end. He's doing business with family, and it doesn't work out. And so he has to draw this literal line in the sand and set up a boundary and say, we're not going to do that anymore. This has come to an end. And we follow his story along, and pretty soon we start seeing that his ability to influence his kids wasn't that great. And his ability to be a really meaningful parent wasn't that great. And his kids start doing horrifying things like murdering an entire village of people. to get revenge for something. And they come to him, and he really has reached the ending of his influence with his kids, and he has to sit back and reconcile with the fact that his kids are turning out to be something he's not super proud of, but he doesn't know really what to do with that. And so he's always trying to negotiate with what's happening in his kids' lives. He reaches this end of a parenting era and doesn't necessarily know what to do with it. And then he has a wife that he loves deeply, and she dies suddenly in childbirth, and grief falls upon him. And he loses a couple other close family members during that time, and grief just comes upon him like a blanket, and he doesn't know what to do with it. He has an ending of precious relationships in his life and deep, deep loss. And these endings have sprung themselves upon him, and he finds himself at a loss. And somewhere along the way, he decides, I didn't like the way that things with Esau ended. We see some maturity begin to develop in him. And as an older man, he says, I actually didn't like the way things ended with my brother. And he actually reaches out to meet his brother. His brother said, I'll kill you if I ever see you again. And after a couple decades, he reaches out and he says, can I see you again? And that ending changes because Esau actually meets him, and instead of blood, there's tears. And they hold each other and they cry and they weep for the time that they've lost. The ending actually changes the way that it handles. But some of the spiraling from his sons continues because Joseph, if you've ever heard of the story of the kid with the colorful coat, that's Jacob's son. And Joseph is very jealous. His brothers are all very jealous of how much his dad loves him, understandably. And what they do is decide to sell him off into slavery. And Jacob suffers another loss. And then a famine hits, and his business suffers, and he suffers another loss. And he can't provide for his family anymore. We could go on and on and on. All these random endings kept coming into his life that he didn't entirely know what to do with. And by the time he got to the end of his life, you can see him seeking to make better decisions, seeking to do better when it comes to his endings and how to finish. And you almost wonder, he gets to the end of his life, and you almost wonder what he wants to pass down to his kids and grandkids. You almost wonder, with someone who has seen this much, who has suffered this much, who has been through so many painful and unexpected endings, so many endings that are his own fault, so many endings that are the fault of others around him, you wonder what he's going to say on his deathbed to his kids, hoping that they can do better than he did. And if it's most of us, maybe we would say something like, don't make the mistakes that I made. Here's some advice that I've learned the hard way. Here's how I hope you make better decisions than me going forward. Here's some of the regrets that I have that I hope that you don't step into. Here's how to make a better decision and not fight with your brother so much. Here's how to make a better decision and treasure the time that you have left with your loved ones. We might have any list of meaningful advice to give in our deathbed in that way. But Jacob says none of that. One day, Joseph, when Jacob is close to death, Joseph, his son Joseph, brings his sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, to Jacob. And he says, can you bless your grandsons, Dad? Can you give them a final blessing? Can you give them a word to carry with them in their life? That's something they know that their granddad handed down to them. Can you give them a blessing? And Jacob doesn't say any of what we would expect of his hard-won wisdom. Instead, he says simply this: may the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys. He realizes by the end of his life, he realizes that despite his best intentions, even though he's better at finishing now than he was in his youth, despite his best intentions, he realizes he still dropped the ball in some places. And he realizes that the answer is not to try harder. The answer is not to try and compensate for your mistakes. The answer is not to hand down the perfect gem of advice so that your family line can do better. The answer is none of those things. The answer is instead to turn to Jesus, who's the perfect finisher, and say, I'm letting him write my story. And I have some bumpy chapters in there. But you know what? I have peace on my deathbed because God has been with me all the while. God has been close to me when I've made the right decisions and the wrong ones. God has ultimately delivered me from all harm. Even though I went through so much, I suffered so much, God has ultimately delivered me and shepherded me through some very difficult seasons. Jacob's life was a mess, but he finished really well. His life was a mess, but he finished really well, he said to his grandsons the only thing that really, truly mattered in that moment, which is blessing them that they would be loved by God in the same way that he was. He handed down to future generations a better way of living, a better life with Christ, because he realized he couldn't do it in his own strength. It's a simple but difficult thing to accept. When we allow God to tell our stories, we can still finish well. And maybe some of you in this room are going, I have some deep regrets. I have some things I wish I would have finished differently. And the invitation is still that you can finish well, because God can take even the most complicated of stories and turn it into something really beautiful like he did for Jacob. Maybe some of you are actually right now faced with a series of decisions and circumstances, and you don't know how it's even possible to finish well because it's so overwhelming. There's so much that's out of your control. You go, even if I did my part and finished well, this still wouldn't finish well. And maybe the invitation is, you know what, take to life group this week, take to some friends, call a pastor, do what you need to do to get someone with you, praying for you, supporting you, giving practical advice on how you can finish well in something. But the goal is to get to the end of our lives and be able to have this kind of peace on your deathbed that goes, despite all the ways that I finished well, despite all the ways that I didn't finish well, what I want to hand down to others is the knowledge that they're not alone. God is with them, and God is showing his love to them in all the finishing well and finishing poorly. And so my invitation as we close this morning is just to have a moment of honesty with yourself. If you need to write down some notes, if you need to spend a moment just closing your eyes, breathing, reflecting, whatever that is for you, to just reflect on this question: what do you need to finish well? What do you need in your life in order to finish well wherever it is? Maybe you're like, I'm looking at the big picture of life, Katie, and I got to figure out how to wrap things up well. I got to figure out how to finish this life well. Maybe you're looking at a very specific circumstance in front of you, finishing a degree program or a job, finishing a relationship or a period of life that you're in. Whatever it is, what do you need? What do you need to ask God for? What do you need to ask your community for in order to be able to finish well? And then my invitation is to take that and sit with it. And maybe you need to share it with somebody. Maybe you need to think about it for yourself. Maybe you need to take some questions to God. But we'll have just a moment of quiet in this room, and then the band will come up afterwards and we'll sing a song before we head out this morning. So go ahead and take just a moment. What do you need to finish well?